You think you've had rough mornings? Try waking up in Iceland during the year 950, smack dab in the middle of the Viking Age, when this frozen island was home to some of the toughest, most resourceful people who ever lived. You'd open your eyes expecting maybe some coffee and a quick scroll through social media, but instead you're about to face a day so absolutely brutal, so packed with deadly survival challenges and social customs that could literally get you killed, that your modern survival instincts would be completely useless. We're talking about a place where the winter darkness lasts for months, where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could spark a blood feud that lasts generations, and where your biggest concern isn't whether your Wi-Fi is working, it's whether you'll have enough dried fish and fermented shark meat to survive until spring. Let me paint you a picture of what your first hour would look like. It's still dark outside, and I mean pitch black dark, because you're dealing with an Icelandic winter where the sun barely peeks over the horizon for a few hours each day. The temperature inside your turf house is probably around freezing, and that's considered warm compared to the howling winds and sub-zero temperatures outside that can literally freeze exposed skin in minutes. You're not waking up in a cozy bed with memory foam and Egyptian cotton sheets. No. You're lying on a raised platform covered with whatever animal skins and furs your family managed to collect with Tramond. Talking about rough sheep pelts, maybe a bear skin if you're lucky, and possibly some seal skin that still smells like rotting fish. You're sharing body heat with probably 6 to 10 other people, including extended family members, servants, and maybe even some livestock if the weather is particularly nasty. Privacy? That's not even a concept that exists yet. The first thing you'd notice is the smell, and trust me, it's not pleasant. We're talking about the concentrated aroma of unwashed human bodies that haven't seen soap in months, animal waste from the livestock sharing your living space, smoke from the central fire that's been burning continuously for months and has filled every fabric with its acrid scent, fermented fish hanging from the rafters, and that special blend of dampness and decay that comes from living in a structure that's literally built into the ground and covered with grass and dirt. Your modern nose, accustomed to air fresheners and daily showers, would probably start watering immediately, and you probably gag or even vomit, which would be absolutely mortifying in a culture where showing weakness is social suicide. But here's the kicker: complaining about the smell would immediately mark you as soft and weak, two qualities that could get you socially ostracized or worse in a society where reputation and honor mean everything. Now, assuming you can handle the sensory assault without embarrassing yourself, you'd need to figure out what to wear. Forget about checking the weather app on your phone. First of all, you don't have a phone, and second, the weather in Iceland changes so fast that even if you could somehow predict it, you'd be wrong within an hour. Your clothing options are limited to layers upon layers of wool scratchy, often unwashed wool that's been dyed with whatever natural materials were available, like bog iron for browns and reds, or imported madder root if your family is wealthy enough. We're talking about woolen underwear that feels like wearing a hair shirt, woolen tunics that are probably infested with lice, woolen pants that chafe with every step, woolen cloaks that are so heavy they could double as blankets, and if you're lucky, maybe some leather boots that hopefully still have most of their waterproofing intact. The whole outfit probably weighs about as much as a modern winter coat, but provides maybe half the warmth, and definitely none of the comfort. But here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean potentially deadly. You can't just throw on whatever clothes you want. Your social status, your family's reputation, and even your personal safety all depend on wearing the right thing. The colors, the quality of the fabric, the style of the brooch holding your cloak together, all of these things communicate vital information about who you are and where you fit in the social hierarchy. Wear something too fancy, and you might be accused of putting on airs above your station. Wear something too plain, and you might be seen as bringing shame to your family. And God forbid you should accidentally wear something that looks like it belongs to a thrall, a slave, because that's a mistake that could follow you for the rest of your very short life. Speaking of thralls, let's talk about the absolute minefield of social dynamics you'd be navigating from the moment you open your eyes. In your modern world, you're used to a certain level of equality and basic human rights. In Viking Age Iceland, society is stratified in ways that would make your head spin. You've got jarls at the top, wealthy landowners who basically function as local warlords. Then you've got carls, who are free farmers and craftsmen. And at the bottom, you've got thrall slaves who have absolutely no rights and can be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's whim. Your survival depends on immediately figuring out where you fit in this hierarchy and acting accordingly. Because stepping out of line isn't just embarrassing, it can be fatal. The house you're waking up in is called a longhouse, and it's basically a dark, smoky tunnel made of stone, turf, and timber. The walls are thick, they have to be, to provide any insulation against the brutal Icelandic weather, but they're also damp and often crawling with insects. The roof is made of turf and grass, which means it's constantly leaking and occasionally collapsing. There are no windows because glass doesn't exist in your world, and openings in the walls would just let in the cold and wind. The only light comes from the central fire and maybe a few oil lamps burning whale or seal oil, which adds its own lovely aroma to the mix. The wait, it gets worse. That central fire I mentioned? It's not just for warmth and light, it's literally the difference between life and death. If that fire goes out during a winter storm, everyone in the house could freeze to death within hours. And guess what? Keeping it going is a full-time job that requires constant attention, specific types of fuel, and knowledge that you absolutely don't have. The fuel isn't just wood. Iceland doesn't have many trees. Instead, they burn dried sheep dung, peat, and whatever driftwood they can scavenge from the beaches. The smoke from this combination is absolutely toxic, and there's no real ventilation system, except for a hole in the roof that's probably partially blocked by snow. Now, let's talk about the bathroom situation, because this is where your modern sensibilities are really going to take a beating. There is no bathroom. There's no indoor plumbing, no toilet paper, no privacy, and definitely no hand sanitizer. When nature calls, you have two options. There's a communal bucket in the corner of the longhouse that everyone shares, or you can brave the elements and head outside to the designated area. In winter, that second option could literally kill you. We're talking about temperatures that can drop to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that can knock you over and snow that can be waist deep. Frostbite can set in within minutes, and if you slip and fall in the dark, you might not be found until spring. The communal bucket option isn't exactly appealing either. It's emptied maybe once a day if you're lucky. It's shared by everyone in the household, including the animals, and it's located right there in the main living space where everyone eats, sleeps, and conducts business. The smell is indescribable, and the hygiene implications would horrify any modern person. But complaining about it or showing disgust would immediately mark you as weak and unsuited for survival in this harsh environment. And speaking of hygiene, let's address the elephant in the room. You haven't had a bath in months, and neither has anyone else. The concept of daily bathing simply doesn't exist. Water has to be heated over the fire, which requires precious fuel, and full body washing is reserved for special occasions like weddings or religious festivals. Most personal cleaning involves wiping down with a damp cloth when possible, and even that is considered somewhat luxurious. Your hair is probably matted, your teeth are likely rotting from a diet high in fermented foods and lacking in dental care, and your fingernails are caked with dirt and worse things that I won't even mention. The psychological impact of all this would be devastating for a modern person. You're used to controlling your environment, adjusting the thermostat, turning on lights, grabbing food from the refrigerator. Here, you have control over absolutely nothing. The weather dictates everything. A sudden storm could trap you inside for weeks. A particularly harsh winter could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The darkness messes with your circadian rhythms in ways that would drive most modern people to despair. Seasonal affective disorder would be the least of your problems we're talking about, months of near-total darkness that would challenge even the strongest mental health. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect is realizing your modern knowledge is useless or could get you killed. You can't preserve food without refrigeration, treat infections without antibiotics, navigate by stars, predict weather, repair tools, or defend yourself with medieval weapons. Everything you take for granted becomes a life-or-death struggle requiring skills you don't have. Congratulations, you've survived your first hour in Viking Age Iceland without freezing to death or committing a fatal social blunder. Now comes the real test: breakfast. And let me tell you, this isn't going to be anything like your usual morning routine of grabbing a coffee and maybe some toast. What you're about to experience is a carefully choreographed social ritual where one wrong move could literally end your life, and where the food itself might be more dangerous than the weather outside. First things first, you don't get to eat until everyone else in the household has been served according to their social rank. Remember that hierarchy I mentioned? Well, it's about to become very real, very fast. The head of the household, probably a grizzled farmer or minor chieftain who's survived more winters than you can imagine, gets served first. Then his wife, then any adult sons, then any guests or important visitors, then the other family members in order of age and importance, and finally, if you're lucky enough to be considered part of the family rather than a servant or thrall, you might get your portion. But here's the catch: you don't know where you rank in this system, and asking would be considered incredibly rude and presumptuous. So you sit there, stomach growling, watching everyone else get their food while you try to figure out the complex social dynamics at play. And trust me, everyone is watching you too, judging every expression on your face, every gesture you make, every word you speak or don't speak. Show too much eagerness for food, and you'll be marked as greedy and unworthy. Show too little interest, and you might be seen as ungrateful, or worse, suspicious. The sweet spot is a kind of respectful patience that communicates both humility and worthiness, but good luck figuring out exactly what that looks like when you're operating on zero cultural knowledge and an empty stomach. Now, about that food. Forget everything you know about breakfast. There's no fresh fruit. Iceland doesn't grow fruit. There's no bread made from wheat. Iceland doesn't grow wheat either. There's no milk or eggs from happy farm animals. The livestock are probably half-starved and producing barely enough to keep themselves alive. What you're looking at is a meal that would make most modern people physically ill just from the sight and smell alone. The main course is probably some kind of fermented fish, and when I say fermented, I mean buried in the ground for months until it reaches a state of controlled decay that theoretically makes it safe to eat. We're talking about hackal, fermented shark meat that smells like ammonia and tastes like death. Or maybe some dried cod that's been hanging in the rafters since last summer, collecting dust, smoke, and whatever insects. Decided to make it their home. The texture is somewhere between leather and cardboard, and the taste is indescribably awful to modern palates. But wait, there's more. You might also get some skyer, which is basically a primitive form of yogurt that's so sour it'll make your eyes water. Or perhaps some blood sausage made from sheep's blood mixed with fat and whatever grain the family managed to scrape together. The consistency is lumpy, the color is an unappetizing dark brown, and the taste is metallic and overwhelming. And if you're really unlucky, you might be offered some fermented ram's testicles, which are considered a delicacy but would probably make you vomit on the spot. The drinking situation isn't any better. There's no clean water. I mean, there might be water, but it's probably been sitting in wooden barrels for months, collecting algae and whatever else decides to grow in stagnant liquid. Your options are usually some kind of fermented beverage made from whatever the family could get their hands on. Maybe some weak ale brewed from barley if they're wealthy, or more likely some kind of fermented mare's milk that tastes like sour cream mixed with horse sweat. The alcohol content is usually pretty low, but it's often the safest thing to drink because the fermentation process kills some of the harmful bacteria. Here's where things get really dangerous. You have to eat this food with enthusiasm and gratitude, even if it makes you physically sick. Refusing food or showing disgust isn't just rude. It's an insult to the family's hospitality that could result in being thrown out of the house to freeze to death. Or worse, being challenged to combat by someone who's on a badar. You've just insulted. You have to smile, nod appreciatively, and choke down whatever you're given while making appropriate sounds of satisfaction. But the social minefield doesn't end with just eating the food. You also have to participate in the conversation, and this is where your lack of cultural knowledge could get you killed. Topics that seem innocent to you might be loaded with political implications. Mentioning the wrong person's name could accidentally reference someone involved in an ongoing blood feud. Expressing an opinion about farming techniques could be interpreted as criticism of your host's methods. Even complimenting someone could backfire if you do it wrong. Praising a man's wife too enthusiastically could be seen as making unwanted advances, while not acknowledging her properly could be seen as disrespectful. The breakfast conversation typically revolves around practical matters: the weather, the condition of the livestock, plans for the day's work, news from other farms or settlements. But underlying all of this is a constant undercurrent of politics, alliances, feuds, and social maneuvering that you have no hope of understanding. Every statement has subtext, every question has implications, and every response is being analyzed for signs of weakness, strength, loyalty, or threat. And then there's the matter of table manners, except there is no table. You're sitting on benches or stools around the central fire, balancing your food on your lap or holding it in your hands. There are no forks; those won't be invented for centuries. You've got a knife, maybe a spoon if you're lucky, and your hands. That fermented shark meat I mentioned? You're tearing it apart with your fingers, and the smell is going to stick to your hands for days. The blood sausage? Same deal. Everything is finger food, and everything leaves a residue that you can't properly wash off. The eating process itself is disgusting by modern standards. People are chewing with their mouths open, making loud smacking and slurping sounds that would horrify anyone accustomed to modern dining etiquette. They're wiping their hands on their clothes, spitting out bones and gristle directly onto the floor, and belching loudly, which is actually considered polite because it shows you're enjoying the meal. The dogs and cats roaming freely through the house are fighting over the scraps, adding their own sounds and smells to the already overwhelming sensory experience. But here's what would really mess with your head: the constant awareness that this meal might be your last decent food for days or even weeks. There's no grocery store to run to when supplies run low, no delivery apps to order from when you're hungry. The food you're choking down represents months of careful planning, preservation, and rationing. Every bite has been calculated to ensure the household survives until spring, and wasting even a crumb could mean the difference between life and death for someone in the family. The portions are small, much smaller than what you're used to. A typical breakfast might be just a few strips of that awful dried fish, a small bowl of sour skyer, and maybe a piece of flatbread so hard you have to soak it in liquid before you can bite through it. Your modern appetite, accustomed to large portions and frequent snacking, is going to leave you feeling constantly hungry and unsatisfied. But complaining about portion sizes would be incredibly insulting to your hosts, who are already sharing more than they can probably afford. Now let's talk about the psychological warfare happening during this meal. Every person at that breakfast table is sizing you up, testing you, trying to figure out what kind of person you are and whether you're going to be an asset or a liability to the household. They're watching how you handle the disgusting food, how you respond to social cues, how you carry yourself, how you speak. They're looking for signs of weakness, dishonesty, cowardice, or stupidity, any of which could justify treating you as less than human. The women are particularly dangerous in this regard because they wield enormous informal power in Viking society despite their official lower status. The lady of the house can make your life absolutely miserable if she decides she doesn't like you, and her opinion carries significant weight with her husband. She's watching how you treat the serving women, how you respond to her questions, whether you show appropriate respect without being obsequious. Get on her bad side, and you might find yourself sleeping with the animals assuming you're allowed to stay at all. The children present their own challenges. In modern society, you're used to kids being relatively powerless and protected. Here, children over the age of about 12 are considered nearly adult and are expected to contribute meaningfully to the household's survival. They're also being raised in a culture that values strength, cunning, and the ability to defend one's honor through violence if necessary. Cross one of these kids, and you might find yourself facing their older brothers or father in combat. Alright, so you've somehow survived breakfast without starting a blood feud or dying from food poisoning. Congratulations. Now comes the part where you discover that everything you think you know about work is completely wrong, and where your soft modern body is about to be pushed beyond its absolute limits. We're talking about manual labor so brutal, so unforgiving, and so dangerous that it makes your worst day at the office look like a relaxing spa vacation. First off, forget about the 8-hour workday. Forget about weekends. Forget about lunch breaks, coffee breaks, sick days, vacation time, or any of the labor protections you take for granted. In Viking Age Iceland, you work from the moment the sun comes up until the moment it goes down. And during the summer months when there's nearly 20 hours of daylight, that means you're looking at workdays that would be considered torture by modern standards. And during the winter, when there's barely any daylight at all, you're still working just by firelight and oil lamps, which makes everything infinitely more dangerous. Your first job of the day is probably going to be something that seems simple, but will nearly kill you: feeding the livestock. Sounds easy, right? Wrong. These aren't the well-fed, domesticated animals you're used to seeing in modern farms. These are half-wild, often aggressive creatures that are just as desperate to survive as you are. The sheep are scraggly and mean, the cattle are basically walking skeletons with horns, and the horses, if the family is wealthy enough to have horses, are tough, stubborn beasts that could easily kill you with a single kick. The livestock are kept in a structure attached to the main longhouse, because keeping them separate would mean they'd freeze to death in winter. This means you're wading through knee-deep animal waste that's been accumulating for months, breathing air so thick with ammonia from decomposing urine and feces that your eyes are streaming and your lungs are burning. The smell is beyond description. Imagine the worst porte party you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 10, and then add the rotting smell of animal carcasses and spoiled feed. Your job is to muck out the stalls, which means shoveling this toxic waste with primitive wooden tools that splinter and break regularly. You're wearing those heavy wool clothes I mentioned earlier, which means you're immediately soaked in sweat and animal waste, and that smell is going to penetrate every fiber and follow you around for weeks. Your hands, even if you had gloves, which you probably don't, are going to be raw and bleeding within hours from handling rough wooden tools and sharp frozen waste. But wait, there's more. You also have to somehow find food for these animals, and in Iceland, that's a challenge that could break your spirit. There's no green grass for most of the year, no corn or grain to speak of, and certainly no convenient feed store to buy from. Instead, you're looking for whatever vegetation managed to survive the brutal climate, mostly scrubby grass, seaweed from the beaches that you have to collect by hand or dodging icy waves, and whatever hay the family managed to harvest and preserve during the brief summer months. Collecting seaweed means hiking down to the shore in weather that could kill you, then wading into freezing water that's rough enough to knock you over and drag you out to sea. You're gathering slimy, rotting plant matter with your bare hands, stuffing it into rough sacks, and then hauling those heavy, waterlogged sacks back up steep, icy cliffs. One slip, one moment of lost footing, and you're either falling to your death on the rocks below, or being swept away by waves to drown in the frigid North Atlantic. The hay situation is even worse, because by this time of year, what hay exists is precious beyond belief. Every strand has been carefully rationed to last through the winter, and you're constantly doing calculations in your head about whether feeding the animals today means they'll starve next month. The hay that remains is moldy, dusty, and often infested with insects and rodents. Handling it means breathing in spores and dust that will leave you coughing and wheezing for hours. Now let's talk about the tools you're using for all this work. Forget about power tools, or even well-made hand tools. Everything is handmade by local craftsmen using primitive techniques and materials that are barely suitable for the job. Your shovel is made of wood with maybe a metal edge if you're lucky, and it breaks constantly. Your rake is basically a bunch of sticks tied together. Your buckets are made of wood and leak. Your ropes are made of twisted plant fibers and animal hair, and they snap under pressure regularly. Every time a tool breaks, which is constantly, you can't just run to the hardware store for a replacement. You either have to fix it yourself using skills you don't have and materials that are scarce, or you have to convince the local blacksmith or carpenter to make you a new one, assuming you have something valuable enough to trade for their services. And while you're waiting for repairs or replacements, the work still has to get done, which means improvising with even more primitive methods. The physical toll this takes on your modern body would be catastrophic. You're used to climate-controlled environments, ergonomic tools, and work that's mostly mental rather than physical. Your muscles aren't prepared for this kind of constant, brutal labor. Your hands aren't calloused enough to handle rough tools and materials. Why? But here's the really terrifying part. There's no workers' compensation, no sick leave, and definitely no medical care if you get hurt. Injure your back lifting heavy sacks of feed? Too bad, the work still needs to get done, and if you can't do it, someone else in the family has to pick up the slack, which makes you a burden rather than an asset. Cut yourself with a sharp tool? Hope it doesn't get infected, because the only medical treatment available is maybe some herbs and definitely some very painful medieval remedies that are more likely to kill you than cure you. And we haven't even talked about the most dangerous part of your workday, dealing with the weather. Iceland's weather doesn't just change at attacks. The wind in Iceland isn't like anything you've experienced in modern life. We're talking about sustained winds of 40 to 60 miles per hour that feel like they're trying to flay the skin from your bones. These winds carry ice crystals that sting like needles, and they're strong enough to pick up rocks and debris that become deadly projectiles. Working in these conditions means you're constantly fighting just to stay upright, let alone accomplish any actual tasks. But you can't just wait for better weather, because better weather might not come for weeks or months. The animals still need to be fed, the water still needs to be hauled from the well, assuming the well hasn't frozen solid, and the endless maintenance tasks that keep the household functioning still need to be done. So you bundle up in those heavy, waterlogged wool clothes that restrict your movement and make you clumsy, and you stumble around trying to do physical labor while fighting against nature itself. The well, if there is one, is probably partially frozen, which means you're lowering a bucket on a rope through a layer of ice that you have to break first. The bucket is heavy when it's full, and hauling it up from depths of 20 or 30 feet while your hands are numb with cold and slippery with ice is an exercise in controlled disaster. Drop the bucket, and you might lose the family's only way of getting water. Fall into the well yourself, and you're dead. There's no rescue services coming to pull you out. The firewood situation is another daily nightmare that would break most modern people. Remember, that central fire in the longhouse is literally the difference between life and death, and it consumes fuel at an alarming rate. But Iceland doesn't have forests. What trees exist are scrubby and small, and they're precious enough that cutting them down is a major decision that could affect the family's survival for years. Instead, most of your fuel comes from other sources that require back-breaking labor to collect. Dried sheep dung, which burns slowly and provides steady heat, but has to be collected by hand from areas where the sheep graze. Peat, which has to be cut from bogs using primitive tools, then dried and stacked, a process that takes months and requires perfect timing with the weather. Driftwood from the beaches, which means long, dangerous hikes to the shore to collect pieces of wood that have been weathered by salt water and might not burn well anyway. Collecting peat is particularly brutal work that would destroy your modern body within hours. You're essentially digging blocks of compressed plant matter out of boggy ground using tools that are barely more sophisticated than sharpened sticks. The work is done in a crouched position that destroys your back and knees, in conditions that are wet, cold, and often muddy enough that you sink up to your ankles with every step. The peat blocks are heavy when wet, and they have to be carried by hand to drying areas where they're stacked in specific patterns to allow air circulation. The psychological impact of this constant, grinding physical labor would be devastating for someone accustomed to modern work. There's no sense of completion, no weekends to look forward to, no vacation time to provide relief. Every single day is a battle for survival that requires your maximum physical effort just to maintain the status quo. And underlying all of this is the constant awareness that one injury, one mistake, one piece of bad luck could do not just you, but everyone depending on your labor for their survival. But even if you somehow manage to master the art of fuel collection, you'd quickly discover that the food situation in Viking Age Iceland would slowly starve you to death in ways that would make modern famine look merciful. The growing season in Iceland is so short that it's barely worthy of the name you're looking at, maybe 3 months where anything resembling agriculture is possible, and even then, only if the weather cooperates, which it rarely does. The staple crops that kept Icelanders alive were barley and hardy vegetables like cabbage and turnips, But these weren't the robust, genetically modified varieties you know from modern supermarkets. These were primitive cultivars that produced tiny yields and failed completely if the temperature dropped even slightly below optimal levels. A single week of unseasonably cold weather, a few too many cloudy days, or a late frost could destroy an entire year's crop, condemning families to starvation. The livestock situation is equally desperate and would shock anyone accustomed to modern farming. Icelandic sheep, cattle, and horses were barely larger than their wild ancestors, producing a fraction of the meat, milk, and wool that modern breeds provide. A cow might produce just enough milk to feed one person for a day, not the gallons we expect from modern dairy operations. The animals themselves were in a constant state of near starvation during the long winter months, surviving on hay that was barely nutritious enough to keep them alive. Preserving food for the 8-month winter was a process so complex and failure-prone that entire families could die from a single mistake. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, using techniques that required precise timing and weather conditions. Fish, one of the few reliable protein sources, had to be caught in waters so cold that falling overboard meant certain death, then preserved using methods that often left the final product barely edible and sometimes trash. Dangerously spoiled. The fermented shark that modern tourists gag on? That wasn't a delicacy or cultural tradition. It was desperate survival food created because fresh shark meat is actually poisonous. The fermentation process, which takes months and requires burying the shark meat in gravel while it rots in a controlled manner, was literally the difference between having protein and starving to death. The fact that it tastes like ammonia-soaked garbage was irrelevant when the alternative was death. Even with all these preservation methods working perfectly, the caloric intake for the average Icelander was so low that chronic malnutrition was the norm. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking Age Icelanders were significantly shorter and had more bone deformities than their descendants today, clear signs of chronic nutritional deficiency. The wealthy might have access to imported grain or luxury foods, but for the vast majority of the population, every meal was a calculated risk between consuming calories now and saving food for the lean months ahead. The psychological toll of this constant food insecurity would be unbearable for modern minds. Imagine going to bed hungry, not occasionally, but every single night for months at a time. Imagine watching your children lose weight and knowing that there's nothing you can do about it because you've already rationed the food as carefully as possible. Imagine the constant mental calculation of whether eating one more bite today is worth the risk of having nothing left tomorrow. The social dynamics around food would be equally alien and disturbing. Families would have to make decisions about which members got priority when food was scarce, typically the able-bodied adults who could work, while children and elderly people might be given smaller portions or lower tasher. Quality food. The concept of sharing a meal as a pleasant social activity would be completely foreign. Instead, every meal was a tense negotiation over resources where someone always left the table hungry. The complete absence of modern hygiene standards in Viking Age Iceland would create health problems that would shock your system into failure within weeks. The concept of daily bathing, clean clothes, or even basic dental care simply didn't exist in any form that would be recognizable today. The result was a population living in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards, with disease transmission rates that would horrify contemporary health officials. Personal cleanliness was limited to whatever could be accomplished with cold water and coarse soap made from animal fat and wood ash, a substance so caustic that it would strip your skin raw with regular use. Most people bathed perhaps once a week during summer months, and far less frequently during winter when heating water required precious fuel. The idea of washing your hair with anything resembling modern shampoo was completely unknown. Instead, people used the same harsh soap or simply rinsed with cold water. Clothing was another hygiene nightmare that would make your skin crawl. Woolen garments were worn for months at a time without washing, accumulating sweat, dirt, and body oils until they became stiff and rank. Linen undergarments, if you were wealthy enough to own them, might be washed occasionally, but the process required so much labor and fuel that it was done sparingly. Most people wore the same clothes day and night, sleeping in garments that had absorbed weeks of accumulated filth. The toilet situation would be particularly devastating for modern sensibilities. There were no toilets, no toilet paper, no concept of private bathroom spaces. Instead, people used communal latrines that were little more than holes in the ground, often shared with livestock. Waste management was primitive to the point of being dangerous. Human waste was often simply thrown into designated areas near the homestead, creating breeding grounds for disease that would make modern sewage treatment seem like a miracle of engineering. Dental hygiene was non-existent in any modern sense. People cleaned their teeth, if at all, using twigs or rough cloth, with no understanding of bacteria or proper cleaning techniques. The result was widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and tooth loss that would begin in early adulthood. Archaeological evidence shows that dental abscesses were common and often fatal, as infected teeth could spread bacteria throughout the body with no antibiotics available to stop the infection. The cumulative effect of these hygiene conditions was a population that lived in a constant state of low-level illness and infection. Skin diseases, respiratory infections, and gastrointestinal problems were so common that they were considered normal parts of life. Body lice, fleas, and other parasites were universal companions that everyone simply accepted as unavoidable. The smell of a typical Icelandic household would be overwhelming to modern senses, a combination of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal waste, and wood smoke that would make most people physically ill. Women faced additional hygiene challenges that would be particularly shocking to modern sensibilities. Menstrual hygiene was managed with rags that were reused repeatedly, often without proper washing. Childbirth took place in the same unsanitary conditions as daily life, with no understanding of sterile procedures or infection control. The maternal mortality rate was catastrophically high, and surviving childbirth was as much a matter of luck as anything else. The psychological impact of living in such conditions would be devastating for someone accustomed to modern standards. The constant itching from parasites, the persistent smell of unwashed bodies and rotting waste. The knowledge that every cut or scrape could become a life-threatening infection, these would create a level of physical discomfort and anxiety that would make normal functioning nearly impossible. Your modern immune system, accustomed to relatively sterile conditions, would be completely overwhelmed by the constant assault of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that Viking Age Icelanders had developed tolerance for over generations of exposure. The Icelandic climate itself is a relentless enemy that would systematically destroy your body and mind through months of conditions that make modern winter seem like a pleasant inconvenience. We're not talking about cold weather that you can escape by going indoors. We're talking about a climate so harsh that it penetrates every aspect of existence and makes survival a daily battle against hypothermia, depression, and physical breakdown. The winter darkness alone would drive most modern people to complete psychological collapse. From November through February, Iceland experiences what's essentially 4 months of perpetual twilight, with the sun barely appearing above the horizon for a few hours each day. But even calling it daylight is generous. It's more like an extended dawn that never quite becomes day before fading back into night. The psychological impact of this endless darkness, combined with the isolation of being trapped indoors, would trigger severe seasonal depression that could easily become suicidal without modern treatment options. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's actively trying to kill you every moment you're exposed to it. Temperatures regularly drop well below freezing, but the real killer is the wind. Icelandic winds are so brutal and persistent that they can strip heat from your body faster than you can generate it, even when you're working hard. Modern people have no concept of what wind chill actually means when it's combined with primitive clothing and inadequate shelter. The wind doesn't just make you cold, it penetrates through every gap in your woolen clothing, creating a constant, own-deep chill that never goes away. The storms that roll through Iceland would terrify anyone accustomed to modern weather forecasting and emergency services. These aren't gentle snow showers, they're violent blizzards that can dump several feet of snow in a matter of hours, accompanied by winds strong enough to knock down a grown man. When one of these storms hits, you don't have the option of staying inside until it passes. The animals still need to be fed and cared for, the fire still needs to be maintained, and the roof might need emergency repairs to prevent collapse under the weight of accumulated snow. Working outside in these conditions would push your body beyond its limits within hours. Your hands would become so numb from cold that you'd lose the ability to grip tools properly, making every task dangerous and inefficient. Your feet would go numb inside primitive leather boots that provide minimal insulation and no waterproofing. Frostbite would be a constant threat, and once you've suffered frostbite damage, those areas become permanently more susceptible to future cold injury. The psychological wear of never being truly warm would break down your mental resilience in ways that modern people can't imagine. In contemporary life, cold is a temporary inconvenience that we escape by going indoors, turning up the heat, or putting on better clothes. In Viking Age Iceland, cold is a constant companion that penetrates your bones and never fully goes away, even when you're sitting directly next to the fire. The knowledge that warmth is always temporary and cold is always waiting would create a level of chronic stress that would be mentally devastating. The spring thaw brings its own set of deadly challenges that would catch modern people completely off guard. As the snow melts, it creates massive flooding that can wash away bridges, damage buildings, and make travel impossible. The ground becomes a treacherous mix of mud, ice, and standing water that makes every step hazardous. What looks like solid ground might actually be a thin layer of ice over deep, freezing water that could trap and kill you if you break through. Even summer weather in Iceland would be a shock to modern sensibilities. Temperatures rarely get above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather can change from pleasant to life-threatening in a matter of minutes. Sudden storms can bring freezing rain, hail, and winds strong enough to make travel dangerous. The concept of reliable, predictable weather that allows for long-term planning would be completely foreign. The constant dampness is perhaps the most insidious aspect of Icelandic weather. Everything is always slightly wet: your clothes, your bedding, your food, your living space. This persistent moisture creates ideal conditions for mold, rot, and disease, while making it nearly impossible to ever feel truly dry and comfortable. The dampness penetrates through wool and leather, creating a clammy sensation that never goes away and contributes to respiratory problems and joint pain. The complete absence of modern medical knowledge and treatment would turn minor health problems into death sentences and make major injuries or illnesses into prolonged torture that usually ended in death. The level of medical care available in Viking Age Iceland was so primitive that it would be considered criminal malpractice by today's standards. Yet it was the best that could be hoped for when injury or illness struck. Basic wound care would shock modern sensibilities with its brutality and ineffectiveness. When you cut yourself, and you would, constantly, using primitive tools for dangerous work, the treatment would involve washing the wound with whatever water was available, often contaminated, and perhaps applying honey or herbs that had no proven antiseptic properties. Stitching wounds was done with needle and thread that hadn't been sterilized, often leading to infections that were worse than the original injury. Deep cuts that would receive professional sutures and antibiotics today would instead be bound with dirty cloth and left to heal or fester on their own. Broken bones were a catastrophic injury that often meant permanent disability or death. The concept of X-rays, proper bone setting, or surgical intervention was completely unknown. A broken arm or leg would be set by feel, often incorrectly, and immobilized using wooden splints and cloth bindings. Many fractures healed crooked, leaving the victim with permanent deformity and chronic pain. Compound fractures, where the bone breaks through the skin, were essentially death sentences due to the inevitable infection that would follow. Dental problems, which we discussed briefly in the hygiene section, would become sources of excruciating, life-threatening agony. A simple toothache could escalate into a facial abscess that would cause weeks of unbearable pain before either resolving on its own or killing the victim through blood poisoning. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia using primitive pliers, often breaking the tooth and leaving infected fragments behind. The pain of major dental work without modern pain management would be enough to drive people to unconsciousness or madness. Childbirth was a terrifying lottery that killed mothers and babies at rates that would be considered apocalyptic by modern standards. Without understanding of sterile technique, proper nutrition, or emergency intervention, every birth was a potential death sentence. Breech births, placental complications, or prolonged labor couldn't be managed with cesarean sections or other surgical interventions. Midwives did their best with herbal remedies and traditional techniques, but their success rate was tragically low. Women who survived multiple childbirths were considered fortunate, and many families lost several children in infancy or early childhood. Infectious diseases would sweep through communities like wildfire, killing large percentages of the population with no understanding of how to prevent or treat them. Simple bacterial infections that respond to antibiotics today would progress to sepsis and death. Viral infections like influenza could kill entire families, especially when combined with malnutrition and poor living conditions. The concept of vaccination, quarantine, or even basic understanding of disease transmission was completely absent. Mental health problems would be interpreted through the lens of superstition and religion, with treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions were seen as spiritual problems or character flaws rather than medical conditions. Treatment might involve religious rituals, herbal concoctions, or even violence intended to drive out evil spirits. The isolation and stress of Viking Age life would trigger mental health crises that had no effective treatment options. Even minor medical problems that we take for granted today would become major sources of suffering and disability. Hemorrhoids, constipation, skin conditions, eye problems, hearing loss, all of these would have to be endured without effective treatment. Pain management consisted of alcohol and perhaps some herbal remedies that provided minimal relief. The concept of surgery for anything beyond the most desperate circumstances was unknown, and even then it was performed without anesthesia or proper antiseptic technique. The psychological impact of living without medical security would create a constant undercurrent of anxiety that modern people would find unbearable. Every minor injury or illness would carry the knowledge that it could easily become a life-threatening condition. Every pregnancy would be shadowed by the very real possibility of death. Every ache or pain would be a reminder that your body is fragile and that help, if it comes at all, would be primitive and often ineffective. The social structure of Viking Age Iceland would feel like living in a suffocating prison where your entire existence is controlled by rigid hierarchies, blood feuds, and social obligations that could get you killed for reasons completely beyond your control. Modern people have no concept of how completely your social position would determine every aspect of your life, from what you could eat to whether you lived or died, and how quickly you could become a social outcast with nowhere to turn. The legal system would be absolutely terrifying for anyone accustomed to modern concepts of justice and due process. There were no police, no courts as we understand them, and no presumption of innocence. Instead, justice was administered through a complex system of blood money, outlawry, and personal vengeance that could spiral out of control with devastating consequences. If someone accused you of a crime, your guilt or innocence would be determined not by evidence or fair trial, but by your social connections, your family's reputation, and your ability to gather supporters willing to vouch for you or fight on your behalf. The concept of being declared an outlaw would be a fate worse than death in many ways. Outlawry meant that you were literally outside the protection of the law. Anyone could kill you without consequence, no one could legally help you, and you had no right to food, shelter, or protection. You would be forced to live in the wilderness like a hunted animal, scavenging for survival while knowing that every person you encountered might decide to kill you for the social status it would bring them. The psychological torture of being completely cut off from human society while still being hunted by it would drive most people to madness or suicide. Blood feuds would trap you in cycles of violence that could last for generations and destroy entire families over disputes that started before you were born. If a member of your family killed someone, or was killed by someone, you would automatically inherit enemies who were honor-bound to seek revenge against you and your descendants. These weren't abstract threats. They were active, ongoing dangers that could result in your death at any moment, often years or decades after the original incident. The stress of living with the knowledge that unknown enemies might be plotting your death would be psychologically devastating. The honor-based culture would force you to risk your life over insults and slights that modern people would consider trivial. Backing down from a challenge or failing to respond to an insult wasn't just socially embarrassing, it could destroy your reputation permanently and make you a target for further abuse. You would be forced to engage in potentially lethal conflicts over matters of pride and social standing, with no option to simply walk away or seek mediation through neutral authorities. Marriage and family relationships would be treated as economic and political transactions rather than matters of personal choice or affection. Women had virtually no say in who they married, when they married, or how many children they would bear. Men had absolute authority over their wives and children, including the right to kill them under certain circumstances. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was considered a man's right and responsibility to control his household through physical force if necessary. The concept of individual privacy or personal autonomy would be completely foreign. Every aspect of your life would be subject to community scrutiny and judgment. Where you lived, what work you did, who you associated with, how you spent your time, all of these would be determined by your social position and family obligations rather than personal preference. The idea of choosing your own career, traveling freely, or making major life decisions independently would be not just impossible, but literally incomprehensible to the society around you. Social mobility was virtually non-existent, meaning that whatever circumstances you were born into would determine your entire life trajectory. If you were born into a slave family, you would die a slave, and so would your children. If you were born into poverty, the chances of improving your situation through hard work or talent were essentially zero. The modern concept of merit-based advancement or educational opportunity would be completely absent, replaced by a rigid caste system that offered no hope of escape. The isolation from the broader world would create a claustrophobic sense of being trapped in a small, closed society where everyone knows everyone else's business and grudges are never forgotten. There was no concept of moving away to start fresh, no anonymous big cities to disappear into, no social services to provide a safety net. Your reputation, good or bad, would follow you throughout your entire life and affect not just you, but your children and grandchildren as well. The constant, ever-present threat of violence would create a level of chronic stress and hypervigilance that would mentally destroy anyone accustomed to modern peaceful society. This wasn't just the abstract possibility of crime that we might worry about today. This was the daily reality that violence could erupt at any moment. From any direction, for reasons ranging from serious disputes to casual social interactions gone wrong. Raiding and warfare weren't occasional disruptions to peaceful life. They were regular features of existence that could destroy everything you'd worked for in a matter of hours. Viking raids didn't just target enemy settlements. They targeted anyone who appeared vulnerable and possessed something worth taking. Your farm, your livestock, your stored food, your family members who could be sold as slaves. All of these made you a potential target for raiders who might travel hundreds of miles specifically to destroy your life. Profit. The weapons that everyone carried weren't ceremonial or symbolic, they were functional tools of violence that were expected to be used regularly. Every adult male was required to own weapons and be ready to use them at a moment's notice. Swords, axes, spears, and shields weren't just for warriors heading off to distant battles. They were everyday equipment for farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who might need to fight for their lives while going about routine business. Personal disputes that would be handled through lawyers or mediation today were settled through combat that could easily result in death or permanent injury. If someone cheated you in business, stole from you, insulted your family, or even looked at you wrong, the socially acceptable response might involve weapons and bloodshed. The legal system actually encouraged this through formal dueling arrangements that were considered legitimate ways to resolve conflicts. Home invasions and theft were constant threats that required families to maintain armed guards and defensive preparations at all times. Your house wasn't just a place to live, it was a fortress that needed to be defended against raiders, outlaws, and neighbors who might decide your possessions were worth more than your life. Sleep would be constantly interrupted by the need to check on livestock, investigate suspicious sounds, and maintain watches against potential attackers. The psychological impact of living in a state of constant readiness for violence would be devastating for modern minds. Every sound at night could be raiders approaching. Every stranger on the road could be a threat. Every social gathering could turn into a bloodbath over a careless word or perceived slight. The hypervigilance required to survive in such an environment would lead to chronic exhaustion, anxiety disorders, and a worldview so paranoid and aggressive that it would be considered pathological by today's standards. Women and children faced additional layers of violence and vulnerability that would be horrifying by contemporary standards. Women could be kidnapped, raped, and enslaved with little recourse, and their own families might consider them damaged goods afterward, rather than victims deserving support. Children could be killed, enslaved, or abandoned if they were considered burdens during difficult times. The concept of protecting the innocent or vulnerable was secondary to survival and social status. The normalization of violence would poison every aspect of social interaction. Entertainment often involved watching or participating in fights that could result in serious injury or death. Social hierarchies were maintained through intimidation and the threat of violence. Even religious and legal ceremonies often involved symbolic or actual violence as a way of reinforcing social order and personal honor. The knowledge that your death could come at any moment, from any direction, for reasons beyond your control, would create a psychological state that modern people would find unbearable. Unlike today, where violence is shocking and unusual, Viking Age Icelanders lived with the understanding that violent death was not just possible, but probable for many people. The stress of this constant threat, combined with the expectation that you would need to commit violence yourself to survive and maintain social standing, would break down the mental health of anyone raised in peaceful modern society. The complete absence of scientific knowledge and rational thinking would trap you in a mental prison of superstition, ignorance, and magical thinking that would make every aspect of existence terrifying and incomprehensible. Modern people have no concept of what it's like to live in a world where natural phenomena are interpreted through supernatural explanations, where illness is blamed on curses rather than germs, and where your survival depends on appeasing invisible forces that may or may not exist. Disease and illness would be explained through a framework of supernatural causation that would be both terrifying and useless for actual treatment. When someone fell sick, the community wouldn't look for medical causes or environmental factors. They would assume the illness was caused by witchcraft, divine punishment, or malevolent spirits. This meant that instead of receiving medical treatment, sick people might be subjected to violent exorcisms, abandoned as cursed, or even killed to prevent the supposed supernatural contamination from spreading to others, where the patterns that we understand through meteorology would be interpreted as direct interventions by gods or supernatural beings who needed to be appeased through ritual sacrifice and offerings. A harsh winter wasn't the result of atmospheric conditions, it was punishment for moral failures or inadequate religious observance. This meant that when facing natural disasters, people would waste precious time and resources on useless religious ceremonies instead of taking practical steps to protect themselves and their families. The astronomical events that we find beautiful or scientifically interesting would be sources of absolute terror for people who interpreted them as omens of doom. Solar eclipses, comets, and unusual weather patterns were seen as signs that the gods were angry and that catastrophic punishment was imminent. The psychological stress of living in constant fear of divine retribution for unknown transgressions would create a level of anxiety that would be clinically debilitating by modern standards. Mental illness would be interpreted as demonic possession or divine punishment, leading to treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. People suffering from depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, or other neurological conditions would be seen as cursed or possessed by evil spirits. Treatment might involve violent exorcisms, physical restraint, banishment from the community, or even execution to protect others from supernatural contamination. The concept that mental illness could be treated medically was completely unknown. The legal system incorporated supernatural elements that would shock modern sensibilities with their irrationality and cruelty. Trial by ordeal was a common method of determining guilt or innocence, involving procedures like walking on hot coals, plunging your hand into boiling water, or being thrown into water to see if you would sink or float. The assumption was that divine intervention would protect the innocent and punish the guilty, regardless of actual evidence. People were tortured, maimed, or killed based on these superstitious procedures. Agriculture and animal husbandry were conducted according to superstitious beliefs that often worked against practical farming methods. Planting and harvesting were timed according to lunar phases and religious calendars rather than optimal growing conditions. Livestock illness was treated with charms and rituals rather than veterinary knowledge. The result was lower crop yields and higher animal mortality rates that contributed to the chronic food shortages that plagued the community. Navigation and travel, which were essential for survival in Iceland's harsh environment, were conducted using a mixture of practical knowledge and supernatural beliefs that could lead travelers to their deaths. While Vikings were skilled navigators, they also relied heavily on omens, dreams, and ritual consultations to make crucial decisions about when and where to travel. A misinterpreted sign could lead an entire group into deadly storms or uncharted territory. The worldview that governed daily life was so fundamentally different from modern rational thinking that it would feel like living in a constant nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Every decision, from what to eat to where to live, would be influenced by supernatural considerations that had no basis in reality. The inability to understand or predict natural phenomena through scientific methods would create a sense of helplessness and vulnerability that would be psychologically devastating. Education and knowledge transmission were limited to oral traditions that were often corrupted by superstition and mythology. Children learned about the world through stories that mixed practical information with supernatural explanations, creating a generation that couldn't distinguish between useful knowledge and harmful superstition. The concept of questioning traditional beliefs or seeking evidence-based explanations for natural phenomena was not just discouraged, it was considered dangerous and potentially blasphemous. The psychological impact of living in a world governed by supernatural fear and ignorance would create mental patterns that modern people would find unbearable. Every unexplained event would be interpreted as a potential threat requiring ritual response. Every piece of bad luck would be seen as evidence of supernatural displeasure requiring appeasement. The constant mental energy devoted to managing imaginary supernatural relationships would leave little capacity for rational problem-solving or emotional well-being. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Viking Age Iceland that would destroy modern people psychologically would be the complete absence of hope for a better future. The concept of progress, improvement, or positive change was essentially unknown, replaced by a worldview that saw the current harsh conditions as permanent features of existence that could only get worse over time. There was no concept of technological advancement that might make life easier or more comfortable. The tools, techniques, and living conditions that defined daily life were essentially the same as they had been for generations before, and there was no expectation that they would ever improve. The idea that human ingenuity could solve problems or create better ways of living was completely foreign. This meant that every hardship, every source of suffering, every daily struggle was seen as a permanent feature of existence that would have to be endured forever. The religious worldview reinforced this sense of hopelessness by teaching that the world was in a state of decline, leading inevitably to Ragnarok, the end of the world, in a final, catastrophic battle between gods and deities. Monsters. This wasn't a distant theological concept, it was a fundamental belief that shaped how people viewed their place in the universe. Every generation was expected to be worse off than the previous one, living in the shadow of an approaching apocalypse that would destroy everything. Social mobility was so limited that children grew up knowing that their adult lives would be essentially identical to their parents' lives, facing the same hardships, the same limitations, and the same early death. There was no possibility of education leading to better opportunities, no chance of hard work paying off with improved circumstances, no hope that talent or intelligence could lift someone out of poverty. The modern concept of following your dreams, or making something of yourself, would be literally incomprehensible. The geographical isolation of Iceland meant that there was no possibility of escape to better conditions elsewhere. Unlike other medieval societies where people might migrate to cities or other regions for better opportunities, Icelanders were trapped on an island with limited resources and harsh conditions. The ocean wasn't a pathway to adventure and opportunity. It was a barrier that kept people confined to a life of grinding survival with no alternatives. Life expectancy was so low that most people died before reaching what we would consider middle age, and they knew it. There was no expectation of a long life filled with different phases and opportunities for growth and change. Instead, people lived with the knowledge that they were likely to die young, probably from violence, disease, or starvation. Planning for the future beyond a few seasons ahead was pointless because the odds of surviving long enough to benefit from long-term thinking were so low. The constant cycle of survival tasks meant that there was no time or energy for personal development, creative expression, or the pursuit of individual interests. Every waking moment was consumed by the immediate necessities of staying alive, finding food, maintaining shelter, caring for animals, preparing for winter. The concept of personal fulfillment, self-actualization, or pursuing individual happiness was not just impossible. It was a luxury that no one could afford to even contemplate. The psychological impact of living without hope for improvement would create a level of depression and despair that would be clinically severe by modern standards. The knowledge that your children would face the same hardships you endured, that your sacrifices would never lead to better conditions, and that your entire life would be consumed by the struggle for basic survival would create a sense of futility that would break down the will to live. Modern people, accustomed to the belief that the future can be better than the present, would find this hopelessness absolutely unbearable.